All right, everybody. 2 days in a row, 2 videos. I saw this segment on Destination Linux, one of my favorite shows, and I had talked to Michael a few weeks ago when I was listening in on his stream, and we had some discussions afterwards, and we talked over voice, and thought that it would be a good idea to start talking about these things in a way that makes more sense to people, because I see a section in a Linux show called "The Rise of Immutable Distros," and we're clearly missing the point here. So I'm going to go ahead and let this play. I'm going to stop and interrupt and do all that kind of good stuff, and then see what people say. So let's roll.
We talked about earlier the whole immutable.
Oh yeah, we touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, this is something I think that a lot of people may not understand at all. When you hear immutable, they may think Wolverine and his healing powers or something else, So can you explain?
Oh, because a mutant, mutable. Okay, sure.
Come on. I'm trying with the dad jokes today. I'm trying to take your place.
That one just didn't hit.
I get it.
That one didn't
Plus,
hit.
I've been playing a lot of Marvel Rivals, so I'm not going to lie.
Okay.
Nice.
There's a lot of that.
That's
so
good.
Can you explain what is immutable and why should people care about this?
Before I let Michael answer, I want you all to know, and if you've been on this channel for a while, you know that you're not supposed to care about this. So let's continue.
So it's actually interesting, is a lot of people hear the word immutable and have never heard of it before, and now are being told something that is not accurate. So it's kind of funny because of that, where people think that immutable means that it's kind of like Fedora Silverblue or something like the Ubuntu Core desktop or the Ubuntu Core system or like Fedora Kino White. It's somewhat similar. Like immutability is a factor there, but immutability in terms of like distributions is different than these kinds of distros. Because let's say, for example,
Okay, so he's going to go into this. I'm actually going to skip a lot of the beginning of the conversation because they really get to the meaty stuff later on, and that's what I want to talk about more. But I want you to remember that having read-only /user has been around since the 1980s. Many of these concepts are not new. Actually, Sun did it even over the network. Like you could have a Sunray and the entire OS. That stuff would like come over the network for you. And your data and your config, however, were different. Remember, Universal Blue Images being cloud native, 3 separate things. You have your system image, you have your config, and then you have your user data. So those are 3 separate things, and explicitly split between themselves. Immutable distros makes no sense to me because that doesn't matter. Like whether you use Eon or you use Bluefin, they're not related, right? One is file system snapshots and one is cloud native. There are immutable properties to the disk because of course there are, but that's not a reason to classify distributions in a certain way. Like you wouldn't say VI only distros, right? So let's continue.
For example, you have a Fedora Silverblue. It has an immutable piece, but it's not an immutable distro. So the difference between the two is that the term immutable just means you cannot change it whatsoever. So if you make modifications yourself, they will be replaced no matter.
So this is one of those things that historical, like when Fedora Silverblue first came out, they used the word immutable a lot, right? And the rest of us have been paying for it ever since. So, and SteamOS, when it came out, right, it would change, it would lose your system level changes, right? So people tend to they take all the modern Linuxes and they lump it into immutables, which doesn't make sense to me, but we'll get into that in a little bit.
No matter what. So if you're using something that is an appliance distro that is meant to be used on a particular device or in a particular purpose, then if you make changes and you get an update, it will just wipe all your changes and do whatever it wants and basically resets itself.
Okay,
that's
so
what immutable, like you have.
He does a good job explaining all this stuff.
It's just going to be irrelevant eventually. So like, for example, SteamOS. A lot of people look at SteamOS for the Steam Deck as an immutable system. It's not an immutable system, but it is much more immutable than people consider it to be. So for example,
see, part of the reason this gets so complicated is we spend more time defining the thing than defining the actual features of the OS. But I'll get to that.
Example, if you go in, there's like this dev mode. When you activate dev mode, you can change things around and do all sorts of stuff, but then you update the system it will revert those things and give you the full immutable system. But if you put stuff in your home folder, like you install Flatpaks or you add like files to the system or whatever, then you will keep those things because they're not part of the core system. So they're not part of the immutable factor.
Those are the three things we're talking about. Your base image, your operating system image, that is on Bluefin and uBlue distro. Sorry, I keep looking over to the monitor. Is that is an image that's replaced whole every time you do an update. Then you have your user data, what he's talking about, your documents, your pictures, your photos. And then you have your config, which is all of the settings that you've made to your home directory, your image and stuff. So I put configs are like my GNOME dconf settings, my dot files, because sometimes your data and your config need to be separate on purpose. You don't want them together and conflated. Part of the problem with these traditional monolithic distros is everything is one big ball. Your system, your config, and your data are intermingled in a way that is not conducive to reliability or long-term management or long-term maintenance unless you're a system administrator. And that's a problem we're trying to solve.
But there are actual distributions that are 100% immutable and are not meant to be.
Doing a great job
works
here.
Inside of the system, works with Flatpaks, for example, in that and a little bit of some, and that could be a downside. But the flat technology,
Let's go to the downside,
for example, everything you want works inside of the system, works with Flatpaks, for example, or app image or something like that. It doesn't require to actually be installed into the system. If you have everything that you want that works outside of that immutability, then you're golden.
That's right. You're golden. 96% of people are golden because all they need is a web browser. So this is another one where people are like, well, you can't use these things. What if you use an app that's not a Flatpak? So what? Like part of the reason we made this thing is so you can opt in to a modern environment and leave apps that just aren't there yet for this. So for us, that's very explicit, right? Like we don't specifically say, like I don't sit there and say, all right, 3 more apps and I'm going to convert you. We moved already. Remember, a lot of these systems have been around for a very long time. So our target audience and the people that we resonate with the most aren't going in with so what are the pluses and what are the minuses? They're like, oh, thank God someone is thinking about this in a way that makes sense. So that's just some clarifications there. Because I do read a lot of people that say, these are the downsides. And then they list all of the things that people hate about Linux, including mangling a bunch of old packages into your default install and getting into trouble. Let's talk about that in a minute.
You don't have to worry about it. You're good to go. But there are downsides to that. And the biggest downside would be like the overhead in terms of how the technology works to run it. So if you say, for example, put Steam inside of a Flatpak, there's going to be a little bit of overhead. Not an excessive amount, but there will be some. And then you have some other things that would maybe even be more of an overhead depending on how it's packaged and how it's structured. And that could be a downside. But
So I want to talk about this a little bit because there is a little bit of overhead, particularly with Steam. I have yet to see math on this that shows a significant amount of overhead from running things containerized. Especially when the other option is running it as a deb package so that when you install it, your system doesn't boot anymore. That's right. That problem has not been solved yet, which is one of the reasons that we're doing this. I think instead of overhead, I think the thing that users probably suffer with the most here is applications that are not designed to be sandbox. So like Steam, it needs to have access to certain things. And by default, when things come in RPMs and Debian packages, they're used to having access to everything, right? And we're moving away from that into a zero trust model where the applications need to be untrusted by default. So they need to ask your permission and all of this kind of stuff. So I've yet to see any real raw data where people are like, oh my goodness, LibreOffice, I can't use this because of Flatpak overhead. Although for things like gaming, remember gaming is a special case here because you have VR, you have all those weird hardware configurations and all that stuff, which is why we saw for use cases in uBlue. That's why Bazite exists, because I just used a Flatpak on all my Bluefin systems, and I'm fragging Bazite kids just as well as the next person.
The biggest factor is that you wouldn't really have the flexibility to install absolutely everything, because if it's not available as one of these like Flatpak or app images that don't require being in the system, you're not going to be able to use it.
You're welcome.
And if it is possible to be turned into a Flatpak and there isn't a Flatpak or whatever available, then you would have to wait for someone to actually create that Flatpak for you.
And that's exactly what we're doing, right? We're like making a list, checking it twice, and whatever we need to Flatpak, we're going to Flatpak.
Dive into that a little bit. So in an immutable system, utilizing you can't use like deb in an immutable system, because that's going to require system changes that are completely immutable, and that's completely containerized in my mind.
The whole technically correct thing would be to say that you can use it, but it will be all your changes will be lost.
So this is one of those things where they're describing a immutable system, but it's hard to tell without examples, right? Because someone will be like, well, I can't install a deb. My purpose in life is not to install debs. My purpose in life is to install applications. So if the application is available with Homebrew, it almost always is. And same with Flatpaks. And there are going to be some apps that we're just not interested in. And that's kind of the long tail. But that will always exist. And for that, you have like a distro box. So if you do have that old deb, you can definitely do that. But that has nothing to do with the distribution or whether the user partition is read-only or not.
So instead you use container apps, which include the whole program, all of the necessary.
You can, or I just use Homebrew
files and sister files, cousin files, all that stuff into one little container. That creates some more overhead, but it's containerized, which is an advantage for security and other purposes.
There are benefits. There are pros and cons to the whole situation.
I want to mention the security thing because I don't really talk about it because I let the experts handle that. But I do want to mention that, like Ryan did mention, that there's security benefits and all that stuff. Ask an expert about that kind of thing because there are definitely security benefits here that a lot of experts. It's just not my area expertise. I'm not comfortable talking about it, but I just want to acknowledge that exists.
And with like DistroBox, you could still technically use debs if you wanted to inside of a DistroBox. Or you'd have to be able to use like multiple different distro-based packages and stuff like that. But again, you're using it.
I find this very interesting coming from a distro mindset where it's like, you're making the assumption that I want a distro package. I want the software itself, right? And 9 times out of 10, I'm not finding what I need in a distro package. So that's why I use Homebrew and Flatpak
inside of a container, which is not like an excessive amount of overhead. It's not like it's going to be virtualized because containerizations is very.
You can skip that. Virtualization is definitely heavier.
System where if the
is for someone like me who loves to customize everything, you're not able to go in there.
You would be golden because you don't change anything.
What do you mean? I just went in there.
You would be able to change your wallpaper. So Ryan, you're
still
golden.
Do aliases?
Okay. I find the aliases thing funny because people actually say stuff like this and it drives me nuts. There is nothing you can do on your Linux that I can't do on my Linux. Aliases work exactly like they do everywhere else. I'm still using Fedora. Wallpapers work. Like there's no piece of software I'm like, oh no, I chose an immutable. I can't use it. Like every piece of software available to everyone else in Linux, I can use. So, and I think those of you that have been using our systems know that. But it is good to know the power of a bad rumor that starts early, right?
Probably. I think we're good. You could store that system. Right. I've seen people recently on Reddit say, "I can't believe Linux is so terrible," and then I go into the thread and find out that they installed Linux Mint. Like, okay, that's fine. Replace the desktop with KDE, which KDE Plasma is not available in Linux Mint and is not supposed to be available. And then there's no support for it. And then they started doing stuff with Wine and some other. They're doing a bunch of stuff you're not supposed to do.
Okay. Finally, the meat I've been waiting for, right? It's like somebody pick Linux Mint and that's fine. And then they do what all their friends are doing and their computer breaks. That's not fine. Existing package distributions are designed for system administrators. They would have had that problem with Ubuntu. They would have had that problem with Pop! OS. The idea that like you can grab an operating system and break it to such a level to do what users consider basic tasks has not been working for 30 years. Got the numbers to prove it. That is a great example, Michael. That's not a dig on Linux Mint. It's just people want working computers, man. You know?
Which can cause some issues. Whereas an immutable system, it wouldn't even let you do those things.
You could still break stuff. I think we should just get rid of the dumb ideas. Like when you install an app, your package system shouldn't break. When I started this thing, we went and we looked through like 10 years of Ask Ubuntu data, right? And many of the things that users run into is that they're using a Linux distro based on this old model of mangling individual packages. And as users have told us, and as we know, remember, it's not like we're interrupting a hockey stick growth party around here for the Linux desktop. Users do not want this, right?
So in the case of like people who are not familiar with how these things are interconnected, even if they tried to do it, it wouldn't let them. And except for the fact that if you bypass it, there are ways to bypass it. And if you go that route, it would stop you anyway, because an update would just replace it anyway. So even if you did mess it up, you could just revert back or do an update and it would fix it.
Very cool.
Yeah, this reminds me of a story someone told me about Bazite. They're like, I got Bazite up and working, but it was so bloated, so I switched to something else, but now none of my games work. And they were so mad. I was like, dude, why didn't you just leave Bazite on there?
Now, what's the difference between this and Atomic?
So that's a good question.
Atomic is a brand name by Fedora. Like it's not a thing. They just call it Fedora Atomic because they curse themselves by making immutable. And they also have separate products, right? They have Fedora Workstation, and then they have Fedora Silverblue and Fedora Kinoite. So as distributions add these things, god damn it, immutable distros or whatever, right? They kind of have to justify why they're making a separate product. Universal Blue does not do that because we basically just called bankruptcy on the package system, right? There's no Bluefin Workstation users to upset, so we can just kind of start from scratch. That's what we call that greenfield deployment.
Question. Atomic is more about how it's updated.
I'm going to skip this. The reason I don't like using the word atomic is all transactions are supposed to be atomic. Like if your bank account transaction was an atomic, the modern world would not be able to function. So I think classifying things as atomic and non-atomic doesn't really make sense to me. If your package manager and your operating system are not that way, we should just call them broken. And that's what they are.
Was talking about a Linux or
in case you were wondering. And that's the first time I've heard those.
Beautiful has been talking about it so articulately and beautifully. I'm thinking of it like each distro sandboxes differently. That's why we have different terms, immutable and atomic. It's kind of.
No, the atomic is not even about the atomic grab. This is actually going to be called at some point in the future. These are very cool concepts because they have so much potential, and it's not even just about the user benefits. There's also Michael. Developer benefits, because with the development system, when you have like a distribution that's traditional, then you have these packages that may or may not be the exact same. Because if you install it on a system on a deb-based style or RPM style, when you build these packages out, you're building them out individually, and you're not really guaranteeing that they're all bit for bit the same.
All right, so I do want to address this for developers really quick. This is the problem with having the development environment coupled to that Linux distribution. So in the old days, you got Ubuntu 18.04, you apt-get install PHP, and that was a version of PHP that you had, and that was a platform, right? That's why people choose Ubuntu LTS, right? They know they can have that version of PHP unless you want a new one, and then people added PPAs and things like that. Once containers were invented, all of this jank just goes away, because what happens is the development of all of this stuff happens inside a container. So if I was at work and I had to use Ubuntu 18.04, because platform teams do pick operating systems that way. They say we are platforming on 22.04 for this foreseeable future. They have a roadmap. Someone does that for you. It's like all done, right? All of that work, all of that development has nothing to do with my Bluefin system. My containers have Ubuntu 18.04 in them, right? And then for other organizations, they might just use a PHP container, which is probably Ubuntu or Debian underneath, but nobody says that, right? Like nobody is like wrangling with that, other than the platform team that has to deal with that. They just have to provide their developers a working platform, and that's all managed and good by that platform team and by those developers, right? That has nothing to do with my host operating system, because part of the reason we double down on the containers is it sucks when you use Linux at work and you're the odd one out, right? Because first of all, your coworkers make fun of you as it is, right? Like the second your microphone doesn't work, like they can't wait to remind you that you're using Linux, right? So the development environment being so tied to the OS, that sucks, because on Mac and on Windows, like those people are forced to use containers anyway, because that took over everything, right? At least for our target audience. So by making it the same, it forces Mac, Windows, and Linux into a single container workflow. And that is really good, because then Linux can compete on its strengths, which is the performance of having the containers running on the metal, right? On Mac and Windows, that has to be a VM, and that's more overhead. There's that speed, and there's that all of the cool things that you set up on your Linux system. That's where the real advantage is. So part of the reason we're purposely decoupling the OS and the dev environments is to give us that flexibility
for every single person that uses it. However, with these types of immutable-ish distros, that's what I'll call it for now, immutable-ish.
Just call them Linux, dude.
These distros have a full image that is built and replacing the rest of the whole system. So they know that is exactly the same as everybody else's, which makes the development maintenance problem much smaller,
true.
Because there's not, like, if it works in one way, it's going to work for everyone.
Exactly. All right, let's look. Let's look
Michael,
at the end. They have
first of all, your information on Immutable was fantastic. Thank you so much for covering that. Really was well done. Not as well as Jill said it was, but it was good.
I feel like you're probably right.
I got to meet Jill at scale, but it was only for a few minutes. I got the dinosaur stickers given out though. That was all I wanted to do.
I think it's more like in the middle somewhere.
No, it was very informative. It was very awesome, and I think it's an important thing for people in the community to hear about, because it gets me actually more excited about Immutable in the future there. I think.
And I'm going to leave this with this. Do not be excited about Immutable in the future. Be excited about where Linux is in the present. Remember, we are retreading new ground, right? Like there's a lot of discipline that I feel was lost, with having a conflated OS blob thing that we expect the users to manage themselves. So that's why we really push hard with this model to give people that kind of granular experience that they want.
I think that's going to be a very important part of people's security in the future, especially with not everyone in the desktop has to run it, but there are certain situations where Immutable just absolutely makes sense to run. And so very, very cool stuff.
I think there's tons of potential for maybe Immutable-ish distros. And if they are perfected in the sense that the overhead is no longer an issue and the resource performance and all that stuff is taken care of, and we have gaming is fine and media production is fine, and everything that's intense, like graphics development and media video editing and things like that are like very intense.
Yeah, so I think Michael has a point here, but not on the performance thing. This is more of you have a bunch of applications that have to share data with each other, right? If you're doing your video editing and you've got your photo thing, you got your video thing, you got your special effects thing, and you're you're trying to pipe wire it all together, all of that stuff. In order for all that to work seamlessly and how people expect, it's all about Flatpak portals. It's all about Flatpak portals and getting the applications in place to run in a way that's like modern and people expect their operating systems to run, because every app is just going to have root access to all your stuff. We know that hasn't led to anything. So I think that is really the challenge here. And I think that's why I don't use the term immutable distros, is I don't, like, as I said in my previous video, it's not about the distros. It's about the application ecosystem. I cannot stress this enough. It's about the application ecosystem, getting these Flatpaks in order. And that's where we're starting to focus now. I think this is the first cycle where we've put more effort into apps and getting people pointed towards FlatHub than we have the actual images themselves. Except for Bazite, they're doomed because they have to do a bunch of feature development. But generally speaking, our project is feature complete. like I said, these patterns have been around for, almost a decade now. So for us, it really is more about that refinement and getting people used to that. And like I mentioned in my previous video, we get threads in the forums where people, it just gets so conflated around like, what about local layers and RPM OS tree versus DNF5? Like, you don't have to, if you're worrying about any of that, I am not doing my job. Or you're a Linux nerd. And if you're a Linux nerd, just recognize that, like, I'm not telling my wife anything about this. She just uses the family computer to get to where she needs to go, and then she doesn't have to deal with it. That's really the goal that we're trying to accomplish. Anyway, this was pretty fun. I hope to see more people talking about it. Let's see if he's got anything
for
else.
your hardware. Once those are all settled and we have all the applications available in these kinds of universal formats that make it possible to not need to install it directly, I think that it's going to just skyrocket the usability of the system like mass.
At this rate, we might be able to catch Chromebooks. How long have those been around? I don't know. Anyway, I don't want to get too salty. With that, have a great day, everyone. And remember, tomorrow's the big day for Bazite Bluefin in Aurora. And over the next few weeks, we'll be releasing all the goodness. So have a good one.